18 children, 6 mothers, one hellish gold mine, buried beneath the red earth of West Africa, and above it, silence. A silence bought by gold built by Europeans and paid for with broken bones and stolen childhoods. When President Traoré stepped into that mine, he didn't come with speeches. He came with truth. What he saw wasn't just injustice, it was a machine. A machine designed to crush hope, bury voices, and grind human dignity into dust. Bloodied hands clawing at stone. Children too small to carry light, forced to carry ore. Mothers promised schools handed shovels instead. How did it come to this? And how did one man, one leader become the last wall between corruption and collapse, between silence and salvation? This story is fictional, but the emotions are not. Inspired by truths too often buried and voices too long ignored. May it echo beyond the screen. What would you have done if you stood where he did? The sun sat high above the red earth, an unforgiving eye in a sky bleached white with heat. Dust hung in the air like suspended sorrow, shimmering and still. Below, in a hollowed-out trench carved into the bones of the land, a child no older than 10 stood trembling, a rusted shovel clutched in both hands. His feet were bare, blistered from the jagged stone. His shirt, once yellow, was now a faded ash-colored rag sticking to his sweat-soaked skin. The boy's eyes were fixed on the black barrel of a rifle pointed directly at his face, unmoving, unblinking. The soldier holding the weapon wore a mismatched uniform, half security guard, half mercenary. His finger hovered over the trigger hand, taut with either panic or protocol. His face was hidden behind sunglasses and indifference. But the child saw everything. He saw death just inches away. Behind them, women labored under baskets heavy with ore. Children dug at the walls like ants trapped in a jar. No one moved. No one dared breathe. The air itself seemed to freeze until, boom! A thunderclap of engines shattered the silence. Gravel exploded in every direction. Dust swirled violently. A convoy of matte black trucks, their hoods gleaming under the ruthless sun, descended like a storm onto the pit. The soldier flinched. His aim wavered. The child gasped. From the lead vehicle, the passenger door burst open. A man stepped out, no security, no entourage, no hesitation. He wasn't dressed like a president, no medals, no luxury watch. Just khaki trousers, dusty boots, and a sweat-stained shirt. His head was shaved smooth, his expression unreadable. His name was Traoré, and to most of the world he was a reformist president. But to these people under this sun, at this pit, he was either a savior or a threat. He moved with purpose, walking straight toward the soldier. Not a word spoken, not a single pause. The soldier shouted something in French, blurred defensive. He raised the gun higher now, aiming at Traoré. The child screamed. Traoré did not flinch. Instead, he spoke quietly, firmly. One word. Lower it, that was all. His voice was low, but it carried. Like metal scraping stone. Like thunder just before it breaks. The soldier hesitated. A beat of silence passed. The dust around them settled slightly enough for everyone to see Traoré's eyes were locked on his. Calm, steady, unforgiving. A nearby woman dropped her basket. The clang echoed like a gunshot. The guard's hands began to tremble. Slowly, reluctantly, the rifle lowered. He stepped back as if waking from a spell. The boy collapsed to his knees. Then silence again this time, not from fear, but from awe. The workers had all stopped. Their hands hovered mid-air, shovels frozen above rock. Eyes wide, mouths open, because now they saw him, Traoré, the president, here, among them, covered in dust, sweat, streaking his temple, walking without armor into the very belly of their suffering. And yet even now no one spoke. They were afraid to believe. They had seen too many lies wear suits of power. Too many men arrive with promises and leave with pockets full of gold. But Traoré didn't speak like a politician. He knelt beside the boy, gently placing a hand on his small, trembling shoulder. It's all right now, he said softly. You don't have to dig anymore. The boy looked up. His eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief searched Traoré's face for truth. And for the first time in a long time, he found it. Just beyond the boy's shoulder, a European supervisor in a linen suit watched from behind a fence. Lips tight, sweat pooling at his collar. He reached for his radio but froze when he saw Traoré raise his gaze toward him. The president didn't move, didn't speak, but in his eyes was a message clear enough to pierce steel. This ends now. Traoré didn't linger by the boy's side. He stood slowly, brushed the dust from his knees, and stepped forward straight into the pit. Around him the air felt thicker, like grief soaked into the heat. He moved without a single word of instruction, and yet the crowd parted instinctively as if gravity itself bent toward him. Eyes followed his every step. He walked past a woman whose back was hunched under the weight of a straw basket half her size. Her hands bled through a piece of torn cloth wrapped around her palm. She glanced at him, unsure whether to keep working or collapse where she stood. He gave her a single nod. She lowered her basket and crumpled to her knees, sobbing without sound. Children stared at him from behind piles of rubble, some too young to understand who he was, others old enough to recognize the impossible. A president, their president, walking where no leader had dared. Not in speeches, not in visits, not in dreams. His boots crunched over gravel and discarded tools made for hands smaller than his fist. The pit deepened ahead, swallowing light as they moved toward the main shaft. The rock walls closed in jagged, uneven, veined with fool's gold. Even here, wealth glittered in the stone. And yet all it had bought was silence. Over here a voice said low and hoarse. It was Antoine, a local man with sweat-matted hair and a chest smeared with red clay. His blue shirt, once crisp, was now nearly black from dust. He wiped his brow and fell in step beside Traoré, motioning with a slight nod toward the shadows ahead. "This way, sir. I'll show you what they don't let the cameras see." They descended together down a crude ramp of broken rock and warped wood to the belly of the operation. The air grew heavier, metallic, with the scent of sweat, diesel, and despair. There were no lights here, only battery-powered lanterns swinging from frayed cords, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. A group of young girls passed by their faces, blank eyes avoiding contact. One of them carried a sack nearly twice her weight. Another dragged a rusted sifter, her arm trembling with the effort. Traoré's jaw tightened. Antoine noticed. "This is what they do to eat," he whispered. 12 hours, no water, no light, and the company logs them as volunteers. They stopped in front of a narrow tunnel. Traoré placed his hand against the wall, rough, moist, carved by hands too young to hold tools. His fingers brushed a streak of blood. The silence between the two men stretched. Antoine finally asked what everyone else hadn't dared, "Mr. President, why are you really here?" Traoré didn't answer at first. He turned toward the dark corridor, where cries echoed faintly from deeper in the shaft, half cough, half prayer. He looked back at Antoine, his eyes steady, because no one else came, and then he stepped into the dark. They moved deeper into the tunnel, the ceiling lowering above them, forcing Traoré to duck slightly. The walls pressed in on either side, sweating with condensation and smeared with soot. The air had the thickness of exhaustion, each breath tinged with the copper scent of rust and suffering. "This mine," Antoine began, his voice low, but charged, "was never meant to look like this. At least that's what they told us when they arrived. Men in suits, smiles wide as the horizon." Traoré said nothing, but his presence invited the truth. "They promised us land rights," Antoine continued. "Schools, clinics, roads. They said they'd train the youth, uplift the women, that we would share in the gold, that our village would shine." He scoffed, bitter and tired. "You know what they gave us instead?" Antoine stopped walking, pointing to the jagged ceiling. "They gave us this. Holes. Shackles made of contracts. Children turned into labor. Women digging through tailings with their bare hands." A scream echoed faintly in the distance, a sharp human cry quickly swallowed by the mine's choking air. Traoré's head turned toward the sound, eyes narrowing. Antoine didn't react. That happens every few hours. Some faint, some fall, some don't come back. As if summoned by the words, a commotion rippled through a nearby tunnel. Two young boys stumbled into the corridor, frantic. One of them cried out in Mossi, the local language. Antoine immediately moved. "It's Mama Diarra," he translated. She collapsed. They turned the corner into a dim side chamber. There, in the middle of a heap of rock and grit, lay a woman in her 40s. Her clothes clung to her emaciated frame. Her head lolled to the side, lips cracked, breath shallow. A small crowd gathered helpless. Without hesitation, Traoré stepped forward. He dropped to his knees and carefully lifted her into his arms. Her body was light, frighteningly so. She barely stirred. A child, likely her daughter, stood nearby, tears streaking down her dust-covered cheeks. Traoré looked at her. "She'll be all right," he said softly, though his face betrayed no certainty. He carried the woman out of the shaft, up the incline into the harsh daylight. The heat hit him like a wall, but he pressed forward. At the top of the pit, he laid her down gently on a patch of shade beneath a tarp strung between two crates. Workers had begun to gather. Word had spread. The president was not just visiting, he was carrying their wounded, walking their path, breathing their air. Traoré turned to Antoine. His voice, when it came, was no longer soft. "Shut it down. All of it. From this moment forward, no one digs. No one drills. No one suffers here again in the name of profit." A murmur of disbelief swept through the crowd. Some thought they had misheard. Others thought he was bluffing. But Traoré's face remained carved from stone. The European foreman, who had been lingering near the truck, stepped forward, jaw clenched. "You don't have that authority," he barked. Traoré turned slowly toward him. "This is my land," he said, "and these are my people. You think a license gives you the right to break them? I revoke that right." Immediately, the foreman hesitated but said nothing more. Behind him, the armed guard, the same one who had pointed a gun at the boy, watched in silence. His hand still gripped the rifle, but his knuckles were no longer white. Traoré looked at him unwavering. The guard's eyes met his, then dropped. With a slow, uncertain motion, the man lowered the weapon and let it fall to the ground. No one clapped. No one cheered. But in that heavy silence, something ancient shifted. Not just power, not just fear, dignity. The next morning, long before the sun crested the hills, Traoré stood at the edge of the encampment wearing a faded blue shirt, a dented hard hat, and boots caked in red dust. He looked nothing like a president now. No insignia, no cameras, just another man lost in the machinery of the mine. Beside him, Antoine adjusted the collar of a threadbare khaki uniform. The badge stitched to his chest read, "Supervisor" in bold black letters, an illusion, but convincing enough. They had borrowed the uniforms from a pair of guards who would be conveniently reassigned for the day. No one would notice. Not down here. Not in the dark. "This way," Antoine muttered, voice low, as they approached the tunnel entrance. A different kind of silence lived here. Not the stunned quiet of the day before, but something colder. Something systemic. The entrance yawned open like the throat of an ancient beast lined with scaffolding and cables that buzzed faintly under weak generators. The scent of oil, sweat, and damp earth hit them like a second skin. Inside, the world changed. The corridor was narrow and uneven, carved crudely through the rock. Strips of cloth were tied along the walls, each one a marker left by a miner to find their way back if they ever did. As they descended, lantern light gave way to the flicker of oil lamps, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It was in these shadows that they saw them. Children. Dozens of them. Some crouched in shallow pits, scraping at the rock with tools no larger than spoons. Others carried buckets of stone and silt across planks barely wide enough for a footstep. Their faces were blank, mechanical, too tired to register fear. One boy, no older than 8, dropped his shovel. It clanged against the stone. A guard barked something in French and raised a thin rod. The boy flinched, picked the tool back up, and whispered something barely audible as he turned away. Traoré stopped walking. "What did he say?" he asked quietly. Antoine's face darkened. He said, "Please." They continued deeper, their fake identities shielding them for now. No one paid them much attention. Supervisors came and went, faces blurred by dust and monotony. As long as you shouted, pointed, and walked like you belonged, no one asked questions. Near one of the side caverns, Antoine nodded toward a crude wooden desk under a canopy of wires and dangling bulbs. A thin man with spectacles sat hunched over a leather-bound book, scribbling numbers. "That's the yield log," Antoine whispered. "This is where the truth goes to die." They waited until the clerk stepped away to smoke. Then Antoine moved quickly, flipping open the book. The pages were filled with rows of handwritten entries, dates, tunnel designations, output weights. At first glance, it looked ordinary. But Traoré leaned in. "These numbers," he muttered, "they don't add up." Antoine tapped a finger against the margin. "They're inflating the yield on paper to justify expansion. But they're underreporting the child laborers. See the marks next to section Delta 4. That's where they keep the youngest ones. It's not even listed in the staffing logs. Traoré's jaw clenched. He flipped further back. Some entries were scratched out, rewritten. Others were ghost entries, names with no real workers behind them. They're manipulating it all, Antoine said. Production, payroll, safety inspections. It's a house of cards built on suffering. Suddenly, a sharp cough echoed from nearby. A girl, maybe 12, staggered past them, clutching a cloth to her mouth. When she lowered it, the fabric was streaked with red. Blood. She didn't stop walking. No one did. Traoré closed the ledger and set it back exactly as it had been. "We need to copy this," he said. "We will." "Tonight," Antoine replied. "But there's more you need to see. This mine, it's not just about gold anymore." As they moved deeper into the warren of tunnels, the sound of drills hummed faintly in the distance, like a heartbeat echoing through bone. Traoré didn't speak. His fists were clenched at his sides. He had come seeking truth. Now he was surrounded by it, and it was uglier than he could have imagined. Antoine led Traoré into a side chamber, narrower than the main tunnels, but even more suffocating. The ceiling here was lower, the walls damp and blistered with fungus. The hum of drills was distant, now replaced by a heavier silence, like the mine itself was holding its breath. "This is where they keep the off-shift logs," Antoine whispered, shining a small flashlight toward a makeshift shelf of wooden crates and metal drawers. "They don't expect anyone to look here, especially not someone like you." He pried open one of the drawers. Inside were folders stained with dirt and sweat paper curled at the corners, some singed at the edges. Antoine sorted through them with care until he paused at a thick, worn ledger bound with fraying string. He handed it to Traoré. The cover read, "Night Shift, Children Female Tailings, Strict Internal Use Only, Supervisor Authorization Required." Even before opening it, the weight of it felt wrong. Traoré flipped to the first page. Rows of names, ages, shift hours, Delta 4 Beta 7 unregistered, rotate nightly. Some entries listed children as young as 6. Next to each name was a code, W1, W2, W3, and occasionally a small plus mark in red ink. "What does the cross mean?" he asked, though he already knew. Antoine exhaled. Deceased or disappeared. Traoré's eyes lingered on a page where 6 names had been crossed out. No explanations, no follow-ups, just erased, like they were never here. In the corner of the chamber, he noticed a pile of fabric. At first it looked like discarded sacks, but as he approached, the shape became clearer. Children's clothes, torn, filthy, some stained with dried blood, a tiny pink shoe with no pair, a ripped t-shirt with a cartoon sun printed on the front. It was soaked through with something dark. Near it lay a splint crudely fashioned from 2 sticks and a piece of bandage stiff with time and filth. One piece still had a name tag stitched on it. Safi, age 9. Traoré froze. He reached out and touched the cloth just for a moment. It was stiff, cold, and smelled of rust and rot. Something inside him clenched, not with anger this time, but with something deeper, older. Antoine stood behind him, quiet now. "They take the ones who can't keep up," he finally said. "They don't send them home. They don't tell the mothers. They just vanish." Traoré knelt in front of the pile. His face was unreadable, but his hands resting on his knees were trembling ever so slightly. "This is not a mine," he said softly. "It's a grave." He rose slowly, clutching the ledger in one hand, his jaw tight with silent fury. His gaze swept the chamber once more. The names, the clothes, the absence of anyone to bear witness. Then in a voice only Antoine could hear, he whispered, "I will return. With justice." He didn't look back as he stepped out of the chamber into the dark again. But something had shifted in his walk, slower, heavier, as if every name in that ledger now walked with him. The midday heat had thickened the air like syrup. The mine had quieted for now. Traoré sat beneath a crude awning near the supply crates, a small handheld recorder resting on his knee. He pressed the record button and the device gave a soft click. In front of him sat 3 women, worn dust-covered eyes sunken from long days and longer nights, but still standing. Marama spoke first. She looked no older than 30, though her hands were cracked and calloused like aged bark. Her voice was calm but sharp, like the edge of a knife dulled by repetition. "They told us the mine would bring development. that we'd work a few hours a day and send our children to a new school, that there'd be a clinic, jobs for the men, clean water. Not one promise came true. My husband left when the pay stopped coming. I work 12 hours now with my child tied to my back. He breathes dust before he knows how to read. She looked at Traoré, eyes steady, defiant. They lied, and then they locked us here with the lie. Next was Fatou, her face framed by a blue scarf turned gray with ash. She didn't look up when she began to speak, only picked at the corner of her sleeve, as if the memory was caught in the threads. They came at night, trucks full of uniforms and contracts. They said we'd earn enough to build our own home. But the paper was in French. We only understood one word, gold. Her voice cracked slightly and she paused to swallow. My son was taken first. Too small for lifting, they said. So they gave him the task of sorting tailings. He coughed blood after 3 weeks. I begged them to let him rest. They sent him to a deeper shaft. I haven't seen him since. Her hands trembled as she finished folding themselves into her lap like they were hiding from the truth. Then came Aisha, the youngest of the 3. Her face bore a fresh scar across her temple, a reminder of the day she tried to resist. Her voice was surprisingly strong. I was studying to be a teacher. My parents saved everything for me to finish my training. When the mine opened, they said we'd have jobs with dignity, that we could earn, then go back to school. She looked at Traoré directly. Instead, they gave me a pickaxe. They said I could teach my daughter how to dig. There was silence after that. Not the silence of fear, but the thick, electric quiet of truth finally laid bare. Traoré said nothing. Instead, he leaned forward and held up the recorder. Your voices, he said, will echo beyond the shaft. The women said nothing in response, but their eyes said everything. Marama reached out and touched the recorder gently, like it was something sacred. Fatou wiped her face not from shame, but from determination. Aisha exhaled deeply, her hands unclenching for the first time since she'd arrived. Antoine stepped forward with a bottle of water. They shared it, passing it like a ritual, a small act of dignity reclaimed. Traoré stood. He didn't promise them rescue. Not yet. He didn't offer the same hollow words the corporations had used. But as he looked at each of them, he knew this was no longer just a report. It was testimony. It was resistance. And somewhere inside that mine, among the cries and the dust, the truth had just found its voice. The meeting room inside the presidential compound wasn't ornate. No gilded columns or velvet drapes, just concrete walls, high windows, and a long wooden table scarred by decades of quiet battles fought with ink and strategy. They called it the Hall of Truth, not officially, but among the staff who knew what it meant to wage war without weapons. Traoré entered without ceremony, his sleeves still rolled from the field. Dust still clung to the edges of his trousers. No media, no speeches, just purpose. 3 people waited inside. Zeta, the intelligence chief, sharp-eyed, dressed in black, always 10 seconds ahead of the conversation. Rossi, the financial investigator, Italian-born West Africa raised, fluent in numbers and in power. Kabor, the legal advisor, stoic ex-military, with the calm intensity of a man who had seen systems fall and knew exactly how to bring one down. Antoine stood near the corner of the room holding a thick file. He looked different now, less like a miner, more like a man carrying a story too large for paper. Traoré sat at the head of the table. He didn't look at anyone right away. Instead, he pulled a single object from his pocket and set it gently on the wood, the small blood-stained name tag that read, Safi, age 9. The room fell into silence. Then Zeta broke it. We're ready when you are, sir. Traoré nodded. Rossi opened a laptop and projected a map onto the wall behind them. It wasn't a terrain map, it was a money trail. Arrows connected offshore accounts, dummy corporations, logistics firms, and shell mining subsidiaries. It all pointed back to one European conglomerate masked by layers of plausible deniability. This is the spine of their operation, Rossi explained. It starts with Horizon Extractives registered in Luxembourg, but the real control flows through 3 private equity firms based in Geneva, Lisbon, and Dubai. He clicked again. Funds are laundered through consulting contracts, inflated equipment rentals, and fake environmental offsets. The profits don't stay here. Less than 2% of declared gold revenue ever reaches the national treasury, Kabor added, and the mining permits granted under the previous regime, but they've been illegally extended under clauses that were never publicly disclosed. Zeta took over, sliding several printed photographs across the table. They showed children in narrow tunnels, women hauling rocks with torn palms, foreign supervisors standing behind fences. Next came a series of voice recordings, including Marama Fatou and Aisha, telling their stories in trembling, unwavering tones. Zeta looked at Traoré. We have visual, audio, and testimonial evidence. If this were a trial, we'd already have them cornered. Antoine stepped forward, setting down the final file. This is the human layer, he said, a ledger of names, night shifts, injuries, deaths that were never reported. Every page is signed by a foreman. He paused, then added, including entries for 5 children who disappeared. One was Safi. Kabor opened the folder and scanned it silently. His eyes stopped on the handwriting. These signatures, he said, they're admissible. Traoré leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. And if we go public, Zeta answered immediately, we'll spark international outcry. The corporations will deny. The embassy will push back. There may be sanctions, legal or not. They'll fight. Dirty. Rossi nodded. They're not afraid of losing gold. They're afraid of losing control. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Traoré reached for the recorder again, the same one he had used to capture the women's voices. He pressed play. Marnama's voice filled the room, then Fatou, then Aisha. Their stories unfolded not as background noise, but as the foundation of everything that followed. When the final word faded, Traoré looked around the table. This isn't just about the mine, he said. It's about whether the voices of the poor matter in the face of wealth, whether truth can still rise in a world designed to bury it. The room was silent, but it was no longer unsure. It was ready. The walls of the Hall of Truth had absorbed many difficult conversations over the years, but none had struck so close to the nation's bones as what followed next. Kabor closed the ledger slowly, then set it down with care, as if it contained something radioactive. There's something else, he said, voice controlled. I've been reviewing the permit renewals for Horizon Extractives. They required signature from both the mining authority and local municipal commanders. Traoré raised an eyebrow, and Kabor tapped the edge of the file. The signatures matched down to the stroke. Same pen, same timestamp. But these two offices are 300 kilometers apart. The silence thickened. Zeta narrowed her eyes. Forgery. No, Kabor replied. Worse. Coordination. These weren't forged after the fact, they were processed together. That level of timing only happens when the system itself is complicit. Antoine, who had been listening from the side, leaned in. Then they've been working together all along. The permits, the missing reports, the ignored complaints, it wasn't laziness. It was design. Rossi nodded grimly. And the mine's internal security team. Their salaries aren't paid by Horizon. They're listed under a subcontractor called Rutherford Risk Solutions, registered offshore, but their operational commander is a retired colonel from our National Guard. Zeta added, which means at least part of our military infrastructure is protecting this mine. There it was, not just foreign corruption, but domestic betrayal. Traoré leaned forward slowly, folding his hands together on the table. Who in our government knows? Kabor didn't hesitate. At least 2 provincial governors, 1 senior official in the Ministry of Industry, possibly more. The documents are buried under layers of procurement approvals, but the patterns are there. Zeta stood and walked to the far side of the room. She pulled out a satellite phone and began composing a message. Traoré watched her. What are you doing? Reaching out to the UN Human Rights Council, she said without turning. They have an open file on exploitative mining in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll give them everything under the table for now. We need leverage before the corporations spin the narrative. Kabor turned to the president voice firm. If we move now, we can freeze all operations at the mine within 72 hours. I can issue a provisional order through the Ministry of Justice. We'll lose the element of secrecy, but we'll have legal control of the site. Traoré nodded slowly. Do it. Kabor rose immediately and began typing a secure order into his tablet. Antoine exhaled a slow breath that seemed to release years of frustration, and the guard Zeta finally turned back. They'll be offered a choice: stand down, or be treated as accomplices to human rights violations. Once we go public, no foreign nation will be able to shield them. Not after what we've seen. Traoré's eyes were steady hard. Then they'll know what it means to choose silence over justice. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, the season's first storm gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. But inside the Hall of Truth, the real reckoning had already begun. The courtyard outside the presidential palace had never seen such a crowd. Every major news outlet in the country was present, their microphones clustered like antennae on a podium hastily assembled that morning. Cameramen adjusted lenses, journalists whispered behind raised notepads, unsure of what exactly they were about to witness, but certain it would not be ordinary. At precisely 11 o'clock, the doors behind the stage opened. President Traoré stepped out not in a suit but in the same khaki shirt and boots he had worn into the mine. Dust still clung to the hem. His face was unreadable eyes shadowed beneath the midday sun. But what truly stunned the press was not Traoré. It was the three women who walked behind him. Marama carried a toddler on her hip, the child's hair tied with a faded red ribbon. Fatou wore a long cotton robe, clutching a photo of her missing son to her chest. Aisha, in a simple headscarf, held a microphone not handed to her, but already in her hand as if she had waited years for this moment. The crowd murmured. Some reporters exchanged glances. This was not a political address. This was something else. Traoré approached the podium, adjusted the mic, and let the silence hang long enough to still the rustling, long enough for the tension to become weight. Then he spoke. My fellow citizens, members of the press, and those watching beyond our borders, what I'm about to share with you is not a policy update nor a party line. It is the truth. One long buried, one deliberately hidden. He paused. A foreign-run gold mine operating in our land has for years exploited our most vulnerable women, children, the poor, with the complicity of local officials, with the silence of power. I have seen it with my own eyes. I carry the dust of its tunnels on my skin. He gestured behind him. But these women carry more than dust. They carry the story. He stepped back. Marama stepped forward. Her child gripped her shoulder tightly. Her voice trembled, but she did not falter. I worked 12 hours with my baby tied to my back. When I collapsed, they told me to stand or be replaced. Gas rippled through the press. The microphones clicked with sudden urgency. Fatou held up her photograph. This is my son, Ibrahim. He was 9. He worked the night shift. They said he was transferred to another site. I haven't seen him in 2 years. She did not cry. Her voice was steel. Then Aisha stepped forward, speaking with the calm fury of someone who had been silenced one time too many. They promised us schools. We got shafts. They promised dignity. We got bruises. She turned directly to the cameras. But today we are not shadows. The crowd had begun to shift emotion, swelling in the silence between every word. When Aisha stepped back, someone in the crowd shouted. It was a young woman, no microphone, no stage, but her voice carried. We want schools, not scars. Then another voice picked it up. Then another. The chant spread like wildfire. We want schools, not scars. We want schools, not scars. The rhythm rolled through the square like thunder. Reporters stood frozen, unsure whether to write or join in. Some wiped their eyes. Traoré stepped back to the podium one last time. There will be justice. There will be accountability. In this mine, this system ends today. The crowd erupted not just in applause, but in something deeper. Release, resistance, revolution. The cameras captured it all, and far beyond the palace gates and homes, markets and phones glowing under tin roofs, the people finally saw themselves not as victims, but as witnesses, as a movement, and the world at last would be forced to look. The air in the national courtroom felt electric, thick with anticipation, tight with silence. Every seat in the chamber was filled. Ministers, journalists, survivors, students, and millions more behind screens watching from villages, apartment blocks, offices, and refugee camps. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning, and it was broadcast live. At the front of the room stood a massive projection screen, its surface pulsing faintly in the low light like a lung about to exhale. Behind the bench, 3 judges sat in dark robes, their expressions unreadable. Their presence was solemn, But it was the cameras lining the back wall that truly signaled the gravity of what was unfolding. The world was watching. President Traoré sat in the front row of the gallery just behind the prosecution team. He wore the same expression he had in the mind, calm, unmoved, but utterly present. He had said little in the days leading up to the trial, but his silence had weight. It filled the gaps between headlines. It made even the opposition uneasy. To his left, Antoine sat clutching a thin flash drive, the key to everything. On the opposite side of the courtroom, the defense table was crowded with high-paid attorneys in navy suits and polished shoes. Their ties were immaculate, their briefcases full, their eyes sharp but twitching at the edges. They represented Horizon Extractives, along with 3 European shell companies now exposed as part of the mine's operations. Their job was not to argue innocence, only doubt, distraction, delay. But today they would have none of those luxuries. The lead prosecutor stood. "Your Honors," she began, "we submit this video recovered from an underground shaft by a government investigator as Exhibit 1. With a nod from the judge, the lights dimmed. The screen came alive. Grainy at first, but then unmistakable. A dim tunnel, children crouched under flickering lantern light, their hands trembling as they scraped rock with spoons and rusted tools. A woman cried out in the background. A boy coughed hard and blood hit the wall. Then the camera shifted, catching the glint of a rifle. A voice in French barked a command. The boy flinched. "Silence or you'll bring the roof down." Gas rippled through the room. On screen, another voice, female, weary, whispered, "Please, just let him breathe." More footage followed. Secret conversations between supervisors. A ledger with children's names. Men in Horizon uniforms laughing as they signed off falsified production logs. One even joked, "Kids don't need contracts, they'll be too dead to care." That line hit the room like a slap. The screen went black. No one moved. The European attorneys shifted, murmuring among themselves, suddenly frantic. One leaned toward the bench. "Objection, Your Honors, this footage is unverified, illegally obtained." But before he could finish, the chief judge raised a hand. "Enough." Silence. Then from the back of the room, the chant began, soft at first, then growing. "We want schools, not scars. We want schools, not scars." The judge banged the gavel, but even he did not raise his voice above the chant. Traoré sat motionless, eyes fixed forward. His expression was not triumphant. It was grim, determined. This was not vengeance. It was truth laid bare. The defense team huddled, visibly unraveling. Their polished suits no longer armor. They had come armed with delay tactics and legal loopholes, but they hadn't prepared for mothers with memories, footage with blood, and a country finally refusing to forget. The judges recessed for deliberation, but everyone in the courtroom knew the verdict had already begun forming, not in legal language, but in the breath of the people. Traoré stood slowly and turned to leave the chamber. Cameras followed his every movement. As he passed Antoine, he paused just long enough to whisper. This time they listened. Outside, the crowd waiting in the plaza erupted as the courtroom doors opened, thousands chanting one name. Not his, but Safi's. The courtroom had grown quiet again, but the tension had only thickened. The judges had returned, composed yet visibly affected. Now came the testimonies, the voices the defense had hoped would never speak. The court clerk called out Marama Diabate, witness for the prosecution. A stir passed through the chamber as Marama rose. She walked with slow, purposeful steps. No makeup, no stylists, no dramatics, just her in a faded cotton blouse, baby in tow. Her child dozed quietly against her back, tied with a cloth worn thin by time and labor. She stepped to the stand, took the oath, adjusted the mic. And then she looked straight ahead, not at the lawyers, not at the cameras, but directly at the judges. "I was told I'd be paid for work," she began, "that I'd be given gloves, that my baby could rest nearby while I sorted the rocks." She took a breath. Her voice did not shake. "But they gave us wages for bodies, not lives. They wanted hands that moved, lungs that stayed silent, and backs that didn't break until they did. Then we were replaced. There was no tremble, no fury, just truth spoken with the weight of someone who had repeated it 1,000 times in her head and had finally been allowed to say it aloud. They told us we were building a future, but I have no future left in my body. I traded it for 8 hours a day in a pit with no air and no name tags for the dead." She paused, eyes burning, not with tears but memory. And now you ask me to explain how I know it was wrong. I don't need a lawyer for that. I just needed a courtroom. Silence. Not a cough. Not a murmur. Then came Rossi, summoned by the prosecution. He rolled a metal case to the front of the courtroom, unlocked it, and removed a series of printed payroll sheets, each sealed in clear evidence sleeves and a USB drive. These, he said, are payroll records recovered from Horizon Extractive's internal server. This USB contains the decrypted metadata. These documents were not prepared for external audit. They were meant to stay buried. He handed a page to the judges. Highlighted in yellow were rows labeled night shift. Tailings unit, minors 22 individuals. Pay rate 1, 200 CFA hour. Status temporary casual, no ID required. Some lines even bore nicknames. Petit Roux, Sans Chaussure. One row simply read, Girl 7. Rossi continued, voice steady, almost cold. These records were digitally signed by senior site supervisors. The IP logs confirmed login times consistent with shifts mentioned by multiple witnesses, including Ms. Diabate. The lead defense attorney stood abruptly. Objection, these could have been fabricated after the fact. We've not verified chain of custody, but Rossi was already prepared. Each document contains a cryptographic hash tied to the original time of creation. I can prove that they existed before the public investigation began. If you claim forgery, you're not just accusing us, you're accusing physics. A few in the gallery chuckled nervously. The defense attorney sat down flushed. The judges reviewed the evidence silently. And behind them, the image of a child's broken sandal, photographed beside a payroll ledger, appeared once more on the courtroom screen. The prosecution didn't need to speak again. Marama already had. The national courtroom sat on edge. Not a single camera lens blinked. Outside, thousands gathered beneath an overcast sky, their eyes fixed on towering screens that displayed the chamber in real time. The world held its breath. The chief judge adjusted his robe, his hands steady, but waited. Then he looked up from the long sheet of parchment on the bench. His voice, when it came, was neither cold nor theatrical. It was clear, final. In the matter of the People versus Horizon Extractives and affiliated parties, this court has reached a unanimous decision. The gallery remained frozen. We find the defendants guilty on all primary counts: forced labor exploitation of minors, falsification of operational records, and criminal negligence resulting in loss of life. Murmurs surged like thunder through the chamber. The defense attorney sat in stunned silence. One placed his head in his hands. The judge continued, voice firm, effective immediately, all corporate assets held within this nation's jurisdiction are to be frozen and seized. Mining operations under Horizon Extractives are hereby suspended indefinitely. He paused to let the weight of it settle. Furthermore, senior executives listed in the investigation shall face criminal prosecution, both domestically and, where applicable, through international tribunals. Requests for extradition are being submitted. At the back of the courtroom, someone sobbed loudly, but the judge was not finished. The court also issues an order for individual reparations. Each verified survivor and family of a missing or deceased victim shall be compensated through the National Victim Restoration Fund to be financed by the liquidation of Horizon's assets. Gasps, then applause, then full-blown tears. The room erupted not in celebration, but in release. Years of silence collapsed in a single roaring verdict. Women held hands. Men wept openly. Journalists stopped typing, some overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what they were witnessing. It was not just a legal decision, it was history pounding through marble and into memory. On the prosecution bench, Antoine sat stunned. He turned to Traoré, who offered him a simple nod. No smile, just acknowledgement of pain, of labor, of justice that had finally crawled its way to the surface. As the judges exited the room, cameras zoomed in on the remaining seats. There in the front row, a little girl, barefoot with wide, wondering eyes, sat silently, her gaze locked on the now empty bench. Her mother had been a witness, her brother a name in the ledger. Antoine stepped forward without a word. He gently lifted the girl into his arms. She didn't resist. As he turned to leave the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. Then, unexpectedly from the girl's arms, a sharp cry escaped. One single aching sob followed by more. Not from her, from the room, from survivors, from guards, from court clerks, from the press box. The dam had broken. Tears filled the chamber like water rushing in. For some it was grief, for others relief, but for all it was a reckoning too long delayed. Outside, the crowd saw Antoine emerge with the child and broke into spontaneous chants, justice for the forgotten, justice for the fallen. Traoré followed closely behind, arms at his sides, expression unreadable, but the weight seemed lifted. For the first time in a generation, justice had not whispered. It had roared. The morning sky over the savannah was soft with gold, as if the land itself had decided to give back a little of what it had lost. Where once stood the rusting gates of Horizon Extractives, now there was a clean wooden sign painted by hand, Kanoya Women's Cooperative for Work for Dignity for the Future. Beneath it, people gathered not in protest but in celebration. Families from nearby villages, survivors of the mines, volunteers from across the region. They wore no uniforms. No one carried rifles. Instead, there were baskets of food, a stage made of stacked bricks, and children chasing chickens between shaded tents. At the center of the site, a rectangular plot of land had been marked off with string and stones. Beside it stood a tall woman in a bright yellow dress, Marama, now a cooperative board member. She cradled her son, no longer strapped to her back, but holding a worn picture book in his tiny hands. The chatter died down as President Traoré stepped onto the makeshift platform, accompanied by Antoine and members of the new village council. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't his speech. It was the girl at his side. The same girl Antoine had carried from the courtroom, now, in a clean school uniform, hair braided neatly, holding a small red shovel. Traoré took the mic and waited for the wind to quiet. Then he spoke, not as a politician, but as a man who had seen the bottom and returned. There was a time when this land was dug by force, when children held shovels not to build, but to survive. That time ends now. He turned to the girl beside him. Today, the first shovel in this land will not be for gold. It will be for growth. He stepped down from the platform, took the child's hand, and together they walked to the center of the plot. Photographers readied their lenses. But this wasn't for headlines. The girl placed the red shovel in the dirt. With his hand over hers, Traoré helped press it down. The soil was rich, ready. They turned it once, twice, and the crowd cheered. Not loud, not wild, but deep and full. The kind of cheer that comes when you witness something return hope, reborn through action. Behind them, workers began raising frames for the cooperative building. It would house a women-run mining and agricultural operation, fully regulated, locally owned. No one under 18. Safety officers appointed from the community. Profits shared. At the far end of the plot, children sat in a circle holding books donated by neighboring schools. A teacher read aloud beneath a tree. The only tools nearby were crayons and pencils. One little boy held up a page and shouted with pride, "I drew my mom digging a garden, not a tunnel." Marama laughed through tears. Antoine stood back watching as the cement was mixed, as the beams were lifted, as mothers took over what once nearly destroyed them. He turned to Traoré. "You think it'll work?" Traoré didn't answer right away. He was looking at the girl again, the way she stared at the fresh-turned soil, as if trying to understand what it meant. Then he said quietly, without fanfare, "It already has." The old mine no longer howled with drills or echoed with the cries of the overworked. The shafts were sealed, the machines dismantled, the rusting skeletons of exploitation repurposed for something entirely different. Where once the earth bled, now it breathed. In place of the deepest pit now stood a modest health station, white walls, fresh paint, solar panels gleaming overhead. A nurse from a nearby town administered vitamins and vaccinations to children who had once coughed up blood in the dust. The hallway smelled not of oil and sweat, but of eucalyptus and clean gauze. Just beyond the clinic, the rebuilt shaft control house had been transformed into a bright, airy schoolroom. Its metal walls had been painted over by the very children who now filled it. Swirls of sunflower stars and red-roofed homes danced across every surface. On the blackboard, in looping chalk letters, someone had written, "Today we learn the names of stars." Inside, Aisha stood in front of the class. She no longer wore the fear of yesterday. In a white blouse and long skirt, she spoke with the quiet command of someone who knew her words mattered. She taught science drawing constellations across the board, guiding her students through the names of planets. "You are made of the same atoms as the stars," she said. "Don't ever forget." In the room next door, Fatu sat cross-legged on a mat with 6 young girls guiding their hands as they worked on weaving cloth from dyed thread. She smiled as a child held up her first pattern, uneven but proudly hers. "We weave our strength into every thread," Fatu told them, "and every thread tells a story." Out in the courtyard beside what used to be the equipment loading zone, rows of planters now stretched across the ground. Green leaves burst from rich soil medicinal herbs, vegetables, and flowers. This was the garden of healing, grown from the same earth once torn open for profit. Marama knelt by a planter box with 2 children. She didn't give orders. She pointed, explained, "Let them try." A boy held a leaf to his nose, inhaled its scent, and lit up with curiosity. She nodded, then walked him toward the learning shed nearby. Inside the shed, simple desks had been arranged in a circle. Marama knelt beside a little girl barefoot, hair tied with ribbon, the same child who once stood on the courtroom steps. Marama handed her a pencil. "Write your name," she said softly. The girl hesitated. Then slowly she leaned forward, lips moving silently, as she copied each letter from the chart on the wall. Her hand trembled slightly, but the line curved across the page in an imperfect but unmistakable name: Safina. A camera operator there, documenting their recovery project, captured the moment quietly. Not for drama, but because truth was always worth recording. A child once exploited, now writing herself into existence. From the hill above, Traoré and Antoine watched the scene unfold below them. Laughter carried on the wind. The shouts of students learning to multiply, the rhythmic thump of weaving looms, the gentle rustle of garden leaves. "It's working," Antoine said. Traoré nodded once. "It's healing," and the mind, once a scar, had become something else entirely. The midday sun hung high above the plain, but no one sought shade. Beneath a freshly built wooden pavilion at the center of the cooperative site, villagers gathered shoulder to shoulder. There were no titles here, no distinctions, only names, hands, and a future they were all ready to claim. At the center of the open-air stage sat a long table draped with hand-woven cloth. On top lay a single sheet of parchment, inked in bold script: Kanoya Cooperative Charter for Work with Dignity, for children with futures, for gold that builds, not destroys. It had been written in 3 languages: French, the local dialect, and English, for the world to understand. Aisha stood behind the table with Marama and Fatu. Each of them wore sashes embroidered by the village's new weaving circle, representing their new roles: not survivors, not victims, but founders. One by one, community members stepped forward to sign the charter. Some used practice signatures. Others pressed thumbprints dipped in ink. An elderly man with shaking hands was helped by his granddaughter. A teenager in a school uniform paused, tears welling, before writing her name for the very first time beside her mother's. The moment was not quiet. It was alive, punctuated with laughter, whispers of encouragement, and the hum of music played softly on handmade drums and strings. When Antoine stepped forward to sign, the crowd clapped. When Traoré approached the table, silence fell, not out of fear or awe, but respect. He picked up the pen, paused, and then looked at the crowd. "This paper doesn't belong to me," he said. "It belongs to all of you. It is not a signature of power. It is a pledge to never return to silence." He signed his name clean, bold, final, and stepped aside. Then came a sound that cut through the crowd like a bell ringing through stone. A young boy, no more than 10, stepped forward from the front row, fists clenched at his sides. His voice rang out with no microphone. It didn't need one. "This gold is ours now, not theirs." The crowd froze, then erupted. People shouted, applauded. Some cried. Others raised their fists to the sky. The boy's words weren't rehearsed. They were true, and somehow they had captured everything the last 2 years had built toward. Behind the crowd, workers lifted a wooden pole, tall, straight, carved with patterns representing soil, sun, and water. At the top unfurled a new flag stitched by the women of the village. It bore 3 horizontal bands: green for the land, kono, gold for the people, fernaraning, blue for the future. At its center was a single image, a child's hand holding a book, not a pickaxe. As it rose into the sky, the wind caught it, and the fabric snapped proudly above the crowd. People sang not from a script but from memory, old village songs rewritten with new verses about justice and rebuilding. Drums joined in, feet stomped, dust into rhythm. Traoré stepped back, letting the people take the stage. Marama lifted her son onto her shoulders so he could see the flag better. Fatou linked arms with Aisha, and together they swayed to the music. In that moment, there were no press cameras, no judges, no speeches, just people. And the beginning of something truly shared. A cooperative, yes, but more than that. A community reborn in the exact place where it had once been broken. The winds of change did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Just weeks after the landmark ruling against Horizon Extractives, news outlets across the continent began echoing with a common headline: Burkina Faso breaks the silence. Will we, in Accra, Ghana's Ministry of Mines announced an emergency review of all small-scale mining contracts issued over the past decade. Satellite images and payroll audits were matched against independent whistleblower reports. A parliamentary committee convened this time, not behind closed doors, but live-streamed on national television. A new public hotline was created, and within days it flooded with anonymous tips, many from former workers, others from parents. In Bamako, Mali, the ripples turned to waves. NGOs that had been quietly documenting abuse for years finally stepped into the light. Empowered by what happened in Ouagadougou, 3 major women's organizations submitted a joint petition demanding the inspection of 47 mining operations near the country's southern belt. Local officials, sensing the change in air, began volunteering names, some to protect themselves, others out of guilt. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, a coalition of investigative journalists published a report titled "The Veins of Gold, The Scars of Silence." It included drone footage of children inside fenced compounds in remote Kenyan districts. The timing was no accident. The report was released one day after President Traoré's UN address went viral, and in Cape Town, where multinational mining giants hosted their annual extractive industry summit, the mood shifted from confidence to caution. Usually polished executives now face protesters holding signs that read, "No more gold from blood. Burkina showed us. Now we watch you." The South African Parliament responded with swift optics. A special subcommittee was formed to re-examine historical mining licenses issued to foreign investors. But beneath the performance pressure was building. Former workers from abandoned sites in Limpopo, in the Free State, began speaking to media, many citing the courage of women like Marama and Aisha. From port cities to dry villages, from ministries to classrooms, a quiet awakening had begun. In a university hall in Dakar, a professor of African studies rewrote his syllabus in real time. "This is history," he told his students. "This is not the story of one mine. It is the unveiling of a continent's second colonization, done not with guns, but with contracts and silence." A documentary team in Kigali began pre-production on a series titled After the Shaft. Its pilot focused entirely on Burkina Faso's uprising and the formation of the Konoya Cooperative. The director, herself a child of former miners, said in an interview, "For the first time, our people are not just the tragedy. We are the turning point." In Accra, a school teacher ended her class early one Friday and played a short video of Traoré's speech, the one from the cooperative's opening day. When it ended, a boy in the back raised his hand. "Miss," he asked, "if we find gold here, can we build a school too?" She smiled. "We don't need to find gold, Kwame. We just need to remember who it's for." The winds were blowing from the streets of Accra to the offices of Cape Town, and for once they didn't carry smoke or dust. They carried something far stronger: memory, movement, momentum. In the quiet stillness of his office, President Traoré sat alone. The sun had barely risen, casting soft gold across the wooden floorboards. His jacket hung on the back of his chair. His tie sat forgotten. In front of him was a blank sheet of paper and the weight of everything that had come before. He had spoken to crowds. He had stood in courts. He had held the broken. But this letter, he knew, had to speak not just to now, but to after, to those who would read it long after he was gone. He dipped his pen in ink and began to write, not as a president, but as a man who had once stared into a tunnel and met a child's eyes at the other end. "To those who will one day build with what we once destroyed, I write, not to warn you of what lies beneath the earth, but of what we risk burying within ourselves. You will walk through mines. You will study rock formations, machinery, and economics. But never let any textbook convince you that gold matters more than the hands that dig it. I have seen what happens when we forget. I have held the ledgers. I have walked past the names of children written in pencil and erased in blood. And I have stood beside mothers who could no longer remember the sound of their child's voice. He paused, pressing his fingers to the page as if anchoring the words with his breath. Then he continued, "No mind is worth more than a child's laughter. If you forget that if profit clouds your memory, then you are not an engineer. You are not a builder. You are simply another name on a future list of those who stood by and did nothing." We were given a second chance in the dust of Kanoya. We planted schools where there were scars. We built gardens where there had been graves. But none of it undoes what came before. It only means we finally listened. I hope you do too. Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, citizen of the mine's last dawn. The letter was sealed in a glass case and sent by personal request to every mining university across the continent. In Tarkwa, a geology student pinned a copy above her dorm bed. In Pretoria, a professor opened his ethics lecture, not with statistics, but with Traoré's words. In Nairobi, the letter was debated in classrooms. Some students called it poetry, others prophecy. All of them knew this was more than politics. In time, the letter became part of the official mining curriculum in over a dozen countries. Under a section once called Resource Management, a new heading appeared, Human Legacy and Moral Boundaries in Extraction. And at the top of the chapter in bold italics, "No mine is worth more than a child's laughter." It became more than a sentence, it became a standard. A sentence whispered in boardrooms, quoted in contracts, etched into stone at the entrance of the Kanoya Cooperative. For Traoré, it was just a letter. For a generation, it became a compass. The reckoning did not stop at the borders of Burkina Faso, nor did it remain confined to mining towns or legal courts. Justice had done what few systems could. It had gone viral. It began with a subpoena. International courts, in cooperation with several African governments, issued summons to 6 foreign CEOs of mining conglomerates operating across the continent. These were not small-time executives, but men and women whose signatures had once greenlit billion-dollar deals with the stroke of a pen. Now they were being called to explain how children had ended up under their contracts and into their tunnels. Media swarmed their private jets. Security rushed them past reporters in Paris, Toronto, and Johannesburg. Their faces, previously unknown to the public, now lit up phone screens across Africa, not as leaders of industry, but as symbols of impunity challenged. Behind the headlines, something deeper brewed. On social media, 2 hashtags surged from the ground up: #ChildrenFirst, #JusticeMine. They began in French, then quickly spread to Swahili, Wolof Yoruba, Arabic, and English. Activists across the continent used them to post photos of school children holding signs, mothers standing beside cooperative gardens, and clips from the courtroom in Ouagadougou that had once felt so distant. Even teenagers more used to dance trends and memes joined in. A remix of Marima's courtroom quote over a trap beat hit 1 million plays in 5 days. Influencers who once modeled clothes began modeling conscience. Not just fashion, one caption read, but freedom. Justice Mine. In a TV studio in Dakar, producers of the national youth debate show made a last-minute decision. Instead of inviting a politician or celebrity, they called a quiet 17-year-old girl from Ouagadougou. Her name was Aminata. She wore a simple blue dress and held one thing in her hands: Traoré's letter. The host leaned in. "Why this letter?" he asked her on air. "Why now?" Aminata looked directly into the camera. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "Because we used to dream of getting out of the mines," she said. "Now we dream of leading them, changing them, owning them. Because no mine," she added, her voice rising, "is worth more than a child's laughter." She began to read the letter aloud, word for word from the parchment replica she had printed at school. As she reached the final line, the camera zoomed in her eyes, bright, unwavering. The broadcast went viral within the hour. Major networks replayed the segment. Schools aired it in morning assemblies. University students in Accra and Kigali transcribed it onto classroom walls. In South Africa, a well-known mining investor ended a panel interview by pulling a folded copy of the letter from his coat. "This is now part of every deal I sign," he said. "Every investor needs to read this before they read profit forecasts." Policy began to shift, not just in legislation, but in culture. Multinationals released updated human rights standards, now requiring third-party child labor audits. Mining firms began including local educators and community elders on advisory boards. Several companies suspended operations for ethical restructuring, a term that didn't exist a year earlier. Even in corporate headquarters in London and Zurich, board members began opening meetings with quotes from the Conoya Charter. Not everyone agreed, but no one could ignore it. Justice, it turned out, was contagious, not because it was loud, but because it was true. And once truth entered a room, it rarely left quietly. In Ouagadougou, a mural appeared on the wall outside the Ministry of Labor. It showed a girl holding a pencil in one hand and a gold nugget in the other. Underneath, painted in looping script, "Our wealth is not beneath our feet, it is in our children." And below that, a simple line of text, "Children, first, always." The old mine no longer groaned under the weight of labor. Its tunnels had been reinforced, its air filtered, its darkness reimagined. Where cries and coughing once echoed, now there was silence, sacred, deliberate, and full of meaning. A sign greeted visitors at the new entrance: the Conoya Museum of Hope, where truth is kept alive and silence never wins. The building was carved from the bones of what had once been a loading bay. The tracks, though no longer used, had been polished and kept. They ran through the floor of the exhibit hall like veins, a reminder of the gold that had once cost so many their futures. Inside, the space was dim lit by soft spotlights that guided visitors through a timeline etched into stone and glass. First came the photographs, black and white images of the children at work, of women sleeping on piles of ore, of guards with guns half hidden in shadow. There were video screens looping testimony from the trials and from the survivors, not edited, not polished, just real. On one wall, dozens of birth certificates had been framed. Many were stained or crumpled, some only partial. Above them was a plaque that read, "Names that were never supposed to matter." At the heart of the room, displayed inside a glass pedestal, was a small rusted object, a child's shovel. Barely the length of a forearm, its handle was cracked, its edges worn smooth. It had been recovered from the shaft, now sealed shut, the same place where Safina had been found. And above it, suspended on a thin wire, gleamed a golden plaque cut into the shape of a child's handprint. The fingers spread wide, forever, frozen in the moment of reaching out. The inscription read, "Safina. The first hand pulled from the dark and never again alone." People did not rush through this museum. They moved slowly, quietly. Some cried, some stood still. Children placed notes and paper flowers at the base of the shovel's case. Students whispered their reflections into handheld recorders. Tour guides never raised their voices. Hope was never loud, but it resonated here like a heartbeat through stone. Outside the museum, the dry season winds swept gently across the courtyard. Hundreds had gathered, not in protest this time, but in celebration and remembrance. Wooden benches curved around a small platform covered in cloth the color of deep clay and sky. On the platform stood Marama, her fingers clutching a folded sheet of paper. She wore a white sash embroidered with the names of girls who had once worked in the mines. Aisha and Fatou stood beside her. "This is not a poem," Marama said into the mic. "It is a wound that found its rhythm." She read aloud, her voice carrying through the quiet. "We dug not for gold, but for a way out. We carried silence on our backs, and now we plant songs in the soil. Our children shall not inherit fear. They will inherit our strength." When she finished, applause didn't come immediately. It didn't need to. Instead, children, dozens of them, emerged from the back of the courtyard. Each carried a tiny fabric flag, the same tricolor design that now flew above Conoya, green, gold, and blue. One by one, they walked to the crowd, pinning the little flags onto the shirts and dresses of their parents, their elders, their teachers. A boy climbed onto his father's shoulders to reach his collar. A girl pinned one to the hem of her grandmother's scarf. Antoine stood just off stage. He hadn't spoken today, he didn't need to. His role had always been behind the curtain, behind the lens. But as the children moved through the crowd, one little girl approached him, holding a flag stitched slightly uneven. He knelt down and she carefully pinned it to his shirt. He whispered something to her, voice thick, then pulled away quickly, wiping his eye before anyone could see. From the edge of the crowd, someone began singing. The tune was old, a lullaby, but the words had changed. The hills remember, but now they sing. The gold remains, but we wear the crown. The song caught on. Soon, hundreds of voices joined in. and the flags fluttering on their chests and shoulders became more than decoration. They became declarations. Long after the crowd had gone, long after the songs had faded and the winds grew still, Traoré returned to the edge of the site. He walked alone, dressed not in presidential colors, but in a simple shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. His steps were slow measured. He approached the old shaft, or what used to be one. Now it had been filled in, blessed, and transformed into a medicinal garden. Local healers tended it each morning. Lemongrass, neem, and wild mint grew thickly where sorrow once did. A small wooden sign read, "Here the earth no longer swallows. It heals." Traoré stepped past it, walking to the center of the garden. In his hand was a small stone, worn smooth warm from his palm. He crouched slowly, knees creaking, and placed it gently into the soil between two rows of healing plants. No plaque, no ceremony, just words, for those who never made it back. He remained there, hands still on the stone head, bowed, not in prayer, not in guilt, in memory. Then the wind stirred. Children's laughter echoed from beyond the hill. Traoré turned slightly and smiled. A group of students ran across the open field nearby, chasing each other through rows of trees planted to honor the victims. Their backpacks bounced, their shoes kicked up the red dust. A teacher clapped her hands, calling them back for lunch. They ignored her, giggling. Above them, the Kanoya flag snapped proudly in the breeze, its colors bold against the late afternoon sun. Light streamed through the trees, catching in the dust, casting a golden haze across the earth. But this time the gold wasn't being pulled from the ground. It was rising from it. Traoré stood. He looked out across the garden, the museum, the children, the sky. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him the dust settled. The sun dipped. And the echoes in the earth were no longer cries for help. They were testimonies of healing. They were the sounds of a new beginning. This story reminds us that justice isn't just served in courtrooms, it grows in classrooms, gardens, and in the courage of those who refuse to stay silent. It shows how pain, when faced with honesty and action, can become legacy, not just loss. From one child's hand to a nation's flag, we see how healing begins when dignity is restored. This isn't just a story about gold. It's about choosing people over profit always. What would your community look like if justice, not fear, was its foundation? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.